I'm Courtney McGinley, joined here today with Emma Goldkoff, Jake Santora, Jordan Spagnoli, and Evan Helfin. So a recent documentary series about the untold stories of the toxic and abusive environment at Nickelodeon has been circulating quite frequently on social media, some of which can come as a huge shock because many of us, including us right here, have grew up watching those classic Nickelodeon shows. And before we actually really get into it, I do want to preface that this is a sensitive topic, but Quiet on Set, that's the new documentary series about Nickelodeon, and the primary focus, which I kind of liked, it was started talking with the 90s and kind of like the evolution of Nickelodeon, which I didn't even know all that was a show. And I thought it was interesting how they started at that point. And also, I think it was interesting how the ages on these shows were 6 to 15 years old, which that is the prime years where you learn everything, you grow, you pick up things from your people, your surroundings, you're extremely influenced. So I thought that was insane to hear about all the toxic and abuse.
Well, and I think it's interesting because a lot of the times you hear like, oh, like, is it wrong, child actors, are they too young to be putting into the limelight? And, you see a documentary series like this and you're like, there is so many perils to being in that industry so young. And like you were saying, this is like the prime formative years and you're learning and your surroundings are going to have a big effect on you. And just going through what some of these kids went through at such a young age, you wonder how that's going to follow them for the rest of their life. And obviously it has.
Definitely has.
Absolutely. And like you said, they're in that prime stage of development. And, a lot of what we saw in this documentary was that you had these producers and these higher-ups on these sets that were manipulating and taking advantage of that vulnerability. They deterred those parents away, and you saw that in so many cases, and it obviously developed into worser scenarios, such as like with Brian Peck. But I totally understand, like, they really, really did knock into those formative years and really, really manipulated those kids.
Took advantage.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, too, because Jordan, you mentioned child actors and how they're so influenced in these ages. Mm-hmm. And Dan Schneider, who is the main producer of a lot of these Nickelodeon shows, Nickelodeon's Golden Boy, per se, he actually started out acting before becoming a producer for Nickelodeon in 1994 up until 2018 when him and Nickelodeon split ways. So that's interesting how his behavior probably changed so much from when he was a child actor and then turned into the producer and seeing himself in these little kids. But it's heartbreaking to hear the things he did when he was in those kids' position in the first place.
And it's also weird to say, but maybe like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when you're in a situation like that. Yeah. Can you really be surprised to see that follows you into adulthood and that affects the choices you make? And like you were saying, it can lead to not so favorable ones.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, if there were any, like, producers or directors that he worked with that, like, kind of gave him a hard time or had, I guess, like, mirroring, like, different things that they would just do to Dan, and maybe that had influence. But, like, some things that he would have, like, be produced on his shows, like iCarly, like Zoe 101. Like, I know one of the things that Alexis Nicola, like, talked about was, like, the one scene in Zoe 101 where Zoe, like, squirts or, like, gets squirted, like, on her face, like, with, like, whatever.
Slime.
Yeah, with slime, whatever it was. And that's just so weird. And looking back at it now, I mean, when we were little, like, we thought nothing of it. But looking back at it now, it's just, like, what did they have going on in their minds? Like, why do they think all those producers, all those different, like, directors and, like, just Nickelodeon in general, like, why do they okay some of those things? And, like, the feet in different shows, like, it just kind of goes on and on. It's just weird.
That's something I've seen a lot of people come back to is, well, you don't notice it when you're kids, but going back, looking at it as an adult, and I've seen a lot of sources say that adults, friends, caregivers were present in these scenarios. So I wonder how they let this stuff happen if they were truly present.
And Emma, like you said, like, he was the golden child of Nickelodeon, and he kind of used Nickelodeon as an outlet. He was the kingpin. He had complete creative control over all these shows. He was able to manipulate the execs of Nickelodeon to get these messages across on shows. And whether he believed that they were, intentionally inappropriate or not, it goes without saying that this was all overlooked. He completely had you know, the entire executive team wrapped around his finger, and he was able to get these things across throughout his entire term. I mean, seeing stuff like iCarly and Victorious, like I saw those messages portrayed,
Yeah.
but you never noticed it.
Well,
Exactly.
and I think, Emma, you made a really good point there too, because, I mean, everyone, but especially how you were saying, they're making these innuendos that you don't understand as a child, but when you look back at them now, you're like, how is this allowed? But kind of how you were saying, parents are present on these sets, caregivers are present on these sets. And so while I think part of it is the producers being held accountable, also parents being held accountable and wanting the best for their kid, and kind of going back to that child actor, are they safe in this environment? Are they being forced to do things that aren't favorable to them?
Exactly. I will say, as a kid watching these shows, I picked up on nothing, and there's this particular scene in All That where it was like an SNL for kids. So this one actor, he was dressed up in like a nose costume, and he sneezed. But as a kid, I would just perceive that as, oh, someone's sneezing. And even still to this day, like if nothing came out about it, I probably still would perceive it as, oh, it's just like a nose joke. I don't really think anything of it. And also Dan, he did come out with an apology, and he actually said, I have no problem with he says, I have no problem with that if that's how anyone feels. Let's cut the jokes out of the show. So at least in that regard, he is stepping up. But a lot of people don't think his apology was sincere, which I would have to agree, because a lot of the things, whether you mean it or not, the Ariana Grande video with the potato, that was extremely hard to watch.
Yeah.
And like the water one
Yeah.
too.
Yeah,
They're
Just
upside
disgusting.
down.
that
Any
is
of
something
hers.
that crosses a serious line
Yeah.
versus, like, not to say the nose joke didn't cross a line, but that particular thing really was
And the fact that
horrible
no
to
one
watch.
said a thing.
And it
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
wasn't
How
even
many-
for the show. Like there wasn't a script
Yeah.
for that, or like she
Yeah.
was just like, okay, like go do this, Ariana, and just like filmed it.
And again, the hard part is, how many people does this go through? How many people, like, people see this? There's the writers, there's producers, editors, and again, the parents are there. They're all present for all of this, and not one person said, maybe we shouldn't have our children doing this. Maybe we should make an environment that is comfortable and conducive to being a helpful environment rather than a hindrance. That,
Yeah.
again,
Exactly.
is like,
Yeah.
how did all of this happen with no one thinking, hey, let's step in?
Exactly. Even on All That as well, Brian Peck, he plays this guest star that would appear ever so often called Pickle Boy, and his tagline was, likes to hurt and tease pickles. Like, why did no one even have a thought?
No.
Like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that, like you said, someone's parents aren't going to step in. Like, that's a little edgy. And like you mentioned, Nickelodeon was a little edgier than, like, say, a
Right,
Disney
yeah,
Channel,
yeah.
but still, that does cross a line.
And,
And
you
I know a lot of. Oh, sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I have like a lot of friends too, just like growing up, even like some friends I met here, like their parents didn't let them watch Nickelodeon because it was so like much edgier, and because like they kind of saw through some of those jokes that like were a little too inappropriate. But like again, like some parents kind of like knew what I was getting into. Like I feel like I was able to like watch like iCarly, Victorious, like with my mom when I was like a little bit older, like I kind of like preteen, like teen, high school kind of, and then like it's something we could like watch together. But then like at the same time, like looking back at it now, it's like, who's
Also
really supposed to be watching this? Like older teens or like actual like kids? Like what's your audience and like what's the point? And then also in his statement, he also just like pointed fingers at everyone else pretty much, including like, because he mentioned like how many people like saw those scripts, but like Jordan said, like who's actually approving these and like what makes them think that that's okay.
Yeah, and you touched on his apologies, and so did you. So I kind of want to go through a timeline. So in 2018, Nickelodeon and Dan Schneider split. They parted ways due to behavior complaints, aggressive temper complaints, and him having sort of an obsession with feet, which was just weird, not okay, especially with young kids. In 2021, the New York Times reported verbal abuse of colleagues, that he was prone to tantrums, and that he would send angry emails often. And then in 2022, Business Insider reported other actors, former employees, coming forward and accusing him of gender discrimination. And I assume that's probably when the filming for the documentary started. 2024, the documentary Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV comes out. And there's a lot of stuff in there. I learned so much. It's heartbreaking. If you guys haven't seen it, I totally encourage you to watch it. But it really, I mean, I did my research by Googling, looking through sources, stuff like that, but the documentary just dives so deep.
It does dive really deep. And I think that hits home even for me, as I actually was at the Kids' Choice Awards last year. I was there, I was interviewing all these people. And the thing is, all of these people from the 90s, from the early 2000s, the people that were the pedophiles, they were walking down the carpet that I was on too. And it just gives you the chills watching that documentary, and me being in that realm. It's weird.
Well, and I
Eerie.
think it's interesting how we were talking about the interviews, and he has apologized, saying what I did was wrong and I shouldn't have done that.
And then he was embarrassed
But
too.
the thing is, like, he admits that he did all these awful things. He should be embarrassed about them. But what are the consequences?
Exactly.
What
Right.
consequences has
Right.
he faced?
You know-
What we're looking at is someone who's taking advantage of a powerful position, taking advantage of kids, and admitting it, saying, yeah, I did all these awful things, but scapegoat, he's free. Nothing happened.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, because did he say this apology because he had to say the apology,
Right.
and the apology was made public, whereas I think he should have, I mean, maybe he has privately reached out to these people. I think there's a big difference between privately reaching out to someone and
Right.
publicly reaching out because you have to. Even when it comes to Ariana Grande, a lot of focus is on her right now, because why is she not speaking out? Maybe she is speaking out to the victims privately. I don't think everything needs to be made publicly. I mean, yeah, you have some duty and responsibility, but what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, it's a touchy situation.
Yeah.
And you can't disregard anyone for how they're choosing to handle it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it honestly is an extremely rough situation, and our thoughts go out to every single person involved.
definitely.
It's just
Yeah.
terrible, and I'm sure there's going to be much more to come. I know they just ordered a 5th episode, so I'll be waiting on that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe we'll even have to break down more and do a part 2. But unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. That concludes the entertainment panel, but don't worry, we will have more entertainment and pop culture news for you next week.